Hi, I'm Neil Hermes and welcome to my weekly bird wrap number 21, where I've got a story about turning out the lights in Phillip Island to save birds, a whole new twist on whether or not it's a good idea to be a fancy bird if you want to actually attract a mate, and the thousands of pelicans that are currently breeding in Central Australia. Hi, welcome to my weekly bird wrap, and my first story today is about turning off the lights in Phillip Island, which is in Victoria and where it's famous for penguins and shearwaters, turning off the lights to save the birds. Now, what happens at the end of the breeding season in Phillip Island in around April is that thousands and thousands and thousands of wedge-tailed shearwaters leave their burrows and set off on a 15,000 kilometre migration from southern Australia right across the Pacific Ocean up to the Bering Strait and the Aleutian Islands, and then they do this enormous migration back to then breed the following year in the summer in southern Australia. The young birds, as they come out of the burrows for the first time, have never done this migration. They've been abandoned by their parents and they are essentially thrown to the winds to find their way on this migration. But one of the things that's happened around Phillip Island over the last couple of decades is there's been a lot of housing development, a lot of businesses, and they have lights at night, and the lights can confuse the young birds when they first come out of their burrows. So it's a really delightful story to hear that for a few weeks during that migration period, a whole bunch, I think over 100 different businesses that have lights along the strips along the edges of the water, turn their lights off in the evenings, so that the birds, as they come out, these wedge-tailed shearwaters, otherwise known as mutton birds, as the young birds come out, they're not confused by the lights and they get the best chance they can to set off on this extraordinary migration. So hats off to the guys and the ladies in Phillip Island for turning off the lights to help the birds. These birds, if they survive their first year, they'll live for 30 years. They will fly over 1 million kilometres in their lifetime on these migrations. So to give them a bit of a head start and to not confuse them with the lights when they first start out is the least we can be doing to help the wedge-tailed shearwaters on their annual migration into the Pacific. So my second story this week is about whether or not ornaments and elaborate colouring in males actually does give a bird an advantage, a male bird an advantage in terms of its success in terms of reproduction. It's often assumed that if you're a flashy male with a lot of colours and you've got more colour than the next male along, you're going to be more attractive to females. You will then mate more and more of your offspring will be the ones that survive. And that seems to be the logical thought. But there's been a piece of research that's been going on for 24 years in Spain with flied pycatchers, and they recently produced a paper, and it does rather seem counterintuitive. What they've found is that the more colourful birds, and this is a migrant species, the more colourful birds aren't the most successful ones, the males, in breeding success. Apparently, at the early parts of the breeding season, when the more colourful birds arrive back on the breeding grounds, there are disadvantages because of the social structures of the birds in the community when they arrive. And they're having to compete more. And in fact, it's the slightly less attractive males that are the ones that are more successful in terms of reproduction. This really does seem counterintuitive because you'd wonder why some of the birds become more colourful anyway. But it is an interesting study. It has been going on for 24 years. The data is quite in-depth. A lot of nest box records, a lot of breeding records. So it's an interesting subject, and it'll be interesting to see whether more data comes out of this study and to try and understand what it actually means that some of the birds that are less colourful produce the most number of offspring. But it does work against what we've assumed with a lot of other birds, like birds of paradise and others, where we assume that the more colourful birds are the more successful. My third story today is about pelicans. Now, Australia has been in the grip of one of the wettest periods for decades in the last couple of years. And all of southern Australia has been absolutely soaked in rain. We've had terrible floods along our coastal areas, huge floods inland, and enormous amounts of water accumulating on inland lakes. This has caused all sorts of havoc with a whole range of human activities and with birds, but what it has done is it's created the ideal opportunities for breeding of pelicans. Now, pelicans are very fussy about where they nest and when they'll nest, and some pelicans may only nest 3 or 4 times successfully in a lifetime. But this year, right now, at Lake Brewster in central New South Wales, there are 30,000 pelicans nesting because the conditions are now ideal for those birds. What they need is huge amounts of water because they eat tons and tons of fish of these colonies that are nesting. So there needs to be vast amounts of fish. They also need to be protected, so they have are protected from things like foxes and dogs, so they have an island in the middle of the lake which protects them. So the conditions have got to be just right, and hopefully if they're sustained during the breeding season, the young pelicans will survive and will fledge and be able to join their parents as they migrate. And as these lakes dry out, of course, what we'll expect to see in the next couple of years is the east coast and the coastal areas of Australia will be flooded with thousands of these pelicans that are bred in the inland, and then they may not nest for another 5 or 10 years until the conditions are good again. So fabulous time for pelicans, and if you have an opportunity to be in the inland and you see these large flocks flying about, going about their business, it's one of the great joys of seeing the inland flooded. So that's all I have for you this week. So do check out my website, do check out my YouTube channel, do check out the various safaris that I run, and happy bird watching.